There are moments in life when time fractures, when a single sentence spoken in the dark can shatter the entire architecture of your reality. When you become a witness to your own betrayal and the ground beneath your feet dissolves into something unrecognizable. Something that feels like falling without ever landing. And Carmen knew this feeling the instant she heard her husband's voice through the bedroom door, low and intimate, speaking words that would replay in her mind for months afterward like a terrible song she couldn't escape. She had come home early that Thursday evening, exhausted from a work trip that had been cut short due to a canceled meeting, her body tired but her heart light because she thought she would surprise him, thought maybe they could have dinner together, reconnect after 3 days apart. But when she pushed open the front door and heard his voice upstairs, something in her chest tightened. A small animal instinct that made her pause at the bottom of the staircase, listening. His voice was different, softer than the tone he used with her, almost tender, and she heard him laugh in a way she hadn't heard in years. That easy masculine laugh that once made her feel chosen, special, but now it was for someone else. And then came the words that would cleave her life into before and after. He said, "My wife has no idea I'm keeping a mistress." Said it casually as if he were discussing the weather, as if Carmen's entire existence was just a convenient backdrop to his real life. The secret one, the one where he was alive and passionate and free. She stood frozen in the hallway, her overnight bag still in her hand. And what happened in her body in that moment was not just emotional but profoundly neurological. Her amygdala fired signals of danger so intense that her entire nervous system flooded with cortisol and adrenaline. The ancient parts of her brain screaming threat, betrayal, survival, while her prefrontal cortex tried desperately to make sense of what she was hearing. To construct some alternative narrative where those words didn't mean what they clearly meant. The human brain has an extraordinary capacity for denial, for creating elaborate defense mechanisms that protect us from truths too painful to absorb all at once. And in that hallway, Carmen's mind began to negotiate with reality. Maybe she misheard. Maybe it was a joke. Maybe there was context she didn't understand. But her body knew the truth before her mind could accept it. Her hands trembled. Her breath became shallow. Her heart pounded with such force she thought it might crack through her ribs. Neuroscience tells us that emotional trauma registers in the body before it reaches conscious awareness, that our autonomic nervous system responds to threat faster than our thinking brain can process information. And this is why betrayal feels so physically devastating, why it manifests as actual pain in the chest, why people describe heartbreak as something visceral and embodied. Because it is. Because when the person who promised to protect you becomes the source of danger, your entire biological safety system collapses. Carmen didn't confront him that night. Instead, she quietly left the house, drove to a nearby park, and sat in her car watching the sun set through tears that wouldn't stop coming. Her mind replaying not just what she heard but suddenly reinterpreting months of small moments. The late nights he explained away. The phone calls he took in another room. The emotional distance she had blamed on work stress, on their busy lives. On everything except the obvious truth that he had been living a double life, and she had been the only one in the dark. This is what betrayal does. It forces you to question not just the present but the entire past, to wonder which moments were real and which were performance, which kisses meant something and which were obligation. It makes you doubt your own perceptions, your intuition, your worth. Because if someone could lie to your face every single day while claiming to love you, what does that say about you, about your ability to see reality, about whether you were ever truly known or valued at all? She thought about Isabella, a woman she had met in a therapy group years ago who had discovered her husband's affair through a similar accidental revelation. Isabella had found messages on his laptop while searching for a document he asked her to print. And what struck Carmen most about Isabella's story was not just the affair itself, but what came after. The way Isabella described feeling like she was drowning in her own life, going through motions while internally screaming, smiling at neighbors while her marriage decomposed in private. Isabella had told the group that the worst part wasn't the sexual betrayal. although that hurt profoundly, but rather the emotional abandonment, the realization that while she had been building their life, investing in their future, worrying about his happiness, he had been building an entirely separate existence where she was irrelevant, a character he performed for rather than a person he was genuinely connected to. And this existential erasure, this being made invisible in your own relationship, was a kind of death. The human need for attachment is not just emotional but biological. Our brains are literally wired for connection. We are social creatures who regulate our nervous systems through relationship. And when that primary bond is ruptured, when the person who should be your secure base becomes a source of danger, it triggers the same neural pathways that respond to life-threatening situations. This is why betrayal trauma can create symptoms similar to post-traumatic stress disorder. Why people experience intrusive thoughts, hypervigilance, emotional flashbacks. Carmen spent that first night in a hotel, lying awake in unfamiliar sheets, her mind cycling through questions that had no satisfying answers. How long had it been going on? Who was this other woman? What did she have that Carmen lacked? Were there others before her? Did their friends know? Did his family know? Was she the only person stupid enough to believe in the marriage while everyone else watched her play the fool? Self-blame is one of the cruelest aspects of betrayal. Victims often turn the violation inward, searching for ways they caused or deserved what happened. Because believing you had some control, even if it means believing you failed, feels less terrifying than accepting you were powerless. That someone simply chose to hurt you regardless of your worth or your efforts or your love. And this psychological mechanism, while understandable, becomes a prison that keeps women trapped in relationships that are killing them slowly. When Carmen finally returned home the next morning, her husband Robert acted completely normal, asked about her trip, made coffee, kissed her forehead as if nothing had changed. And this performance of normalcy felt more disturbing than the betrayal itself, because it meant he was capable of extraordinary compartmentalization, capable of looking into her eyes and lying with his whole body, and she wondered how many other mornings had been exactly like this. How many years she had been living in an illusion, while he maintained two separate realities with apparent ease. She didn't tell him what she knew, not that day or the next. Instead, she began a quiet investigation, checking phone records, credit card statements, noticing patterns she had previously ignored, and what she discovered was not just one mistress but a pattern of behavior spanning years. Multiple affairs, secret expenses, an entire hidden life. And with each new piece of evidence, her image of their marriage shattered further, revealing something she no longer recognized. There's a particular kind of grief that comes with this type of discovery. A mourning not just for the relationship as it is, but for the relationship as you believed it to be. You grieve the past you thought you lived, the man you thought you married, the life you thought you were building together. You grieve your own innocence, your trust, your ability to believe in love. And this grief is complicated because the person you're grieving is still there, still sharing your space, still expecting you to perform the role of wife while your entire internal world has collapsed. Patricia's story was different but contained the same emotional architecture. She had overheard her husband on the phone late one night when she got up for water, heard him tell someone that his marriage was just an arrangement, that he stayed for the children but his real life was elsewhere. And Patricia described standing in the dark hallway feeling her legs give out, sitting on the floor with her back against the wall, while her mind tried to process this casual dismissal of everything she thought they had built together. What trauma specialists understand is that betrayal by a primary attachment figure creates a unique form of psychological injury because it violates our fundamental assumptions about safety, trust, and predictability. The person who should be your refuge becomes the source of danger. And this paradox leaves the nervous system in a state of chronic activation, unable to fully relax because the threat lives inside the relationship itself. You can't escape by leaving the room because the danger is the person you share that room with. Carmen eventually confronted Robert 3 weeks after overhearing that phone call. She did it calmly, presented the evidence, watched his face cycle through denial, anger, minimization, and finally a cold kind of admission. He said things like it didn't mean anything, said she was overreacting, said if she had been more available, more understanding, more exciting, he wouldn't have needed to look elsewhere. And this blame shifting, this attempt to make his betrayal her responsibility, was almost more devastating than the original violation. Narcissistic injury is what psychologists call it when someone who has been caught in wrongdoing cannot tolerate the shame of their actions and instead projects that shame onto their victim. They rewrite the narrative so they become the victim. So their betrayal becomes justified response to your failures. And this psychological manipulation, this gaslighting, makes healing almost impossible because you can't process pain that is constantly being denied, minimized, or turned back on you as evidence of your inadequacy. The weeks that followed were surreal. Robert promised to end the affair, begged for another chance, oscillated between remorse and resentment. And Carmen found herself in that terrible liminal space where the relationship is neither fully alive nor fully dead, where you go through the motions of normalcy while internally everything is chaos, where you wake up each morning and have to decide all over again whether to stay or leave, whether to believe his promises or trust your own pain. Her nervous system was in constant dysregulation during this period. She couldn't sleep properly, her appetite disappeared, she developed tension headaches. Her immune system weakened, because when you live in chronic stress your body remains in fight or flight mode, pumping out cortisol and adrenaline day after day until you're physically exhausted. This is what betrayal does to the body. It's not just emotional. It's a full system collapse of your biological sense of safety. Carmen remembered her mother's marriage, how her father had been serially unfaithful, how her mother had stayed and stayed and stayed, performing happiness while slowly dying inside. And Carmen had promised herself as a young woman that she would never accept that kind of treatment, that she would value herself too much to tolerate betrayal. But now here she was, frozen in the same pattern, and she realized that childhood wounds don't just influence our adult relationships. They often determine them unless we do the deep work of healing. The inner child is not just a therapeutic metaphor but a neurological reality. The early attachment patterns we form with our primary caregivers become templates that our brains use to navigate adult relationships. And if you grew up watching a parent accept mistreatment, if love was conditional or inconsistent, if you learned that your worth was determined by how well you could please others, then those neural pathways remain active in adulthood, unconsciously guiding your choices. Your tolerance for poor treatment, your ability to recognize and enforce boundaries. Carmen started therapy with a woman named Dr. Elena Martinez, who specialized in betrayal trauma and relational healing. And in their first session, Elena asked Carmen to describe not just what happened, but what it meant to her. And Carmen found herself crying so hard she couldn't speak. Because what it meant was that she wasn't enough, wasn't lovable enough, wasn't woman enough, wasn't anything enough. And Elena listened with such compassion and then said something that began to shift everything. She said, "Carmen, you are experiencing a normal response to an abnormal situation. Your pain is not evidence of your inadequacy, but evidence of your humanity. Evidence that you loved fully and were deeply injured. And that injury says nothing about your worth and everything about his character." This reframe was crucial because shame thrives in silence and isolation. It tells you that your pain is proof of your deficiency, that you should hide, that you're alone in your suffering. But when someone witnesses your pain without judgment, when they reflect back to you that your response is proportional to the violation, something in the nervous system begins to settle. You start to externalize the shame, to understand that betrayal is something that happened to you, not something you caused or deserved. Over the following months, Carmen began to understand the architecture of her own psychology, how she had learned as a child to prioritize others' needs over her own, how she had developed a hypervigilance around other people's emotions, always monitoring, adjusting, accommodating, trying to prevent abandonment through perfect performance. And this pattern had made her vulnerable to exactly this kind of relationship. Because she had spent years interpreting Robert's emotional distance as something she needed to fix rather than something he needed to address, she had made his betrayal possible by being too understanding, too forgiving, too willing to accept crumbs of attention while he built a feast elsewhere. The concept of codependency often gets misunderstood. It's not about loving too much, but about abandoning yourself in relationship, about making someone else's emotions, behaviors, and well-being more important than your own, about organizing your entire life around managing another person's reality. And this pattern doesn't develop because you're weak or foolish, but because somewhere in your history you learned that your survival depended on keeping others happy, on being indispensable, on never having needs that might burden or displease. Carmen realized she had spent her entire marriage in a state of low-level anxiety, always wondering if Robert was happy, if she was doing enough, being enough, if he might leave if she made mistakes or gained weight or aged or failed to be perpetually delightful. And this chronic anxiety had become so normalized she didn't even recognize it as abnormal. She thought it was just what relationships required, this constant monitoring and adjusting and performing. But healthy love doesn't feel like walking on eggshells. It doesn't require you to diminish yourself to maintain connection. It doesn't punish you for having needs or setting boundaries. Healthy love is a place where both people can be fully themselves, where vulnerability is met with care, where mistakes are opportunities for repair rather than ammunition for abandonment. And Carmen had never experienced this, not in her family of origin and not in her marriage. Which meant she was operating without a template for what genuine intimacy actually looks and feels like. Natalia was another woman in Carmen's therapy group who had discovered her partner's infidelity through a different path. She had felt increasingly disconnected from him over months, experienced a growing sense that something was wrong without being able to name it. And when she finally found evidence of his affair, she described feeling almost relieved, because the evidence validated what her body had been trying to tell her all along, that the relationship wasn't safe, that her intuition wasn't crazy, that the disconnect was real. This is something women often describe, a kind of bodily knowing that precedes conscious awareness. Their nervous system registers danger or deception before their mind can articulate it. But they've been socialized to override these instincts, to trust their partner's words over their own perceptions, to blame their anxiety on insecurity rather than recognizing it as valuable information. And this disconnection from their own inner knowing leaves them vulnerable to extended manipulation. The polyvagal theory, developed by neuroscientist Stephen Porges, helps explain this phenomenon. It describes how our nervous system constantly scans for safety or danger through a process called neuroception. And this happens beneath conscious awareness. Our bodies register subtle cues, tone of voice, facial expressions, energy, and respond accordingly. And when there's chronic incongruence between what someone is saying and what our nervous system is detecting, we experience that as anxiety. Confusion, a sense that something is off. Carmen began to recognize that she had felt this chronic unease for years, but had interpreted it as her own problem, her own insecurity, her own neediness, when actually it was her nervous system trying to alert her to the reality that her relationship wasn't safe, that Robert's words and actions didn't align, that she was living with someone who was fundamentally dishonest, and learning to trust her own perceptions again, to honor her instincts rather than override them, became a crucial part of her healing. She made the decision to leave 6 months after that overheard phone call, not because she stopped loving Robert, but because she finally began to love herself more, or at least to recognize that staying was killing something essential in her. And this decision wasn't easy or clean. It came with enormous grief, with practical complications, with social pressure to try harder or forgive or consider his needs. But Carmen had started to understand that real change happens when the pain of staying becomes greater than the fear of leaving. The day she moved out was both devastating and strangely liberating. She packed her clothes and books and the few items that felt truly hers. And as she walked through the house they had shared, she felt a complex mixture of grief and relief. Sadness for what she had hoped this life would be, and profound exhaustion at finally being able to stop pretending, stop performing, stop trying to love someone back to integrity. What many people don't understand about leaving an abusive or betraying relationship is that the hardest part often isn't the decision itself, but the aftermath. The way your nervous system remains in survival mode even after you're physically safe. The way you doubt yourself at 3 in the morning. The way you feel guilty for prioritizing your own well-being. The way you miss even the painful relationship because at least it was familiar, at least you knew your role. At least you weren't alone with your own thoughts and feelings and vast, uncertain future. Carmen experienced this deeply. There were nights when the loneliness felt crushing, when she questioned whether she had overreacted, whether she should have tried harder, whether she would ever find love again, or if she had just thrown away her one chance at partnership. And these thoughts were not rational, but they were real. They were the voice of her inner child who learned that abandonment was the ultimate danger, who would rather accept crumbs than risk being alone. But she had Alina, and she had her therapy group, and she had started building a different kind of support system. Friends who reflected back her worth, who reminded her why she left when she started to romanticize the past, who could hold space for both her grief and her growth. And this community became a kind of external nervous system regulator, helping her stay present when she wanted to flee back into familiar dysfunction. Somatic therapy became another crucial tool in Carmen's healing, because trauma lives not just in our thoughts but in our bodies, in the tight shoulders and clenched jaw and shallow breathing that become our new normal. And learning to release this physical holding, to let her body discharge the accumulated stress and fear, was like slowly thawing after years of being frozen. She started practicing yoga, not the performance kind focused on achieving perfect poses, but the trauma-informed kind that emphasizes listening to your body, honoring its limits, creating safety in your own skin. And in these practices, Carmen began to reclaim her body as her own, to feel it as something other than an object for others' pleasure or judgment, to experience it as the home she had abandoned in order to survive. The concept of reparenting yourself sounds abstract until you actually begin to do it, until you start to identify the ways your needs weren't met as a child and consciously choose to meet them now, to speak to yourself with the kindness your parents couldn't offer, to set boundaries your family violated, to prioritize your own well-being in ways you were taught were selfish. And this work is not narcissistic but necessary. It's the foundation of genuine healing. Carmen started small. She let herself sleep in on weekends without guilt. She said no to social obligations that drained her. She spent money on therapy and massage and things that nourished her without justifying every expense. She stopped apologizing for taking up space, for having preferences, for existing with needs and desires and boundaries. And each small act of self-care was a revolutionary reclaiming of her right to matter in her own life. A year after leaving, Carmen ran into Robert at a mutual friend's event, and seeing him created a physical response. Her heart raced, her hands trembled, her nervous system immediately activated as if she were in danger, and this response wasn't weakness but wisdom. Her body remembering what her mind might forget, that this person is not safe, that proximity to him means harm. They exchanged polite hellos, but Carmen didn't stay to chat. She honored her body's signals and left early. And driving home, she felt proud rather than ashamed. Because for the first time, she had prioritized her own nervous system over social niceties, over appearing unbothered or mature or fine. She had simply listened to what her body needed and acted accordingly. Robert had reached out a few times over that year. sometimes apologetic, sometimes angry, sometimes trying to rewrite history so the marriage failed because she left rather than because he betrayed her. And Carmen had learned not to engage, not to defend herself or explain or justify. Because people who have harmed you are not entitled to your emotional labor, your forgiveness, or your continued attention. And the most powerful response to manipulation is often silence. This was hard for her at first, the silence, because she had spent her life over-explaining, trying to make people understand, seeking validation for her pain. But she came to understand that her healing didn't require his acknowledgement of what he'd done. She didn't need him to admit fault or apologize sincerely or even understand how much he'd hurt her. Her healing was her own work, and it happened independent of his growth or lack thereof. 2 years after leaving, Carmen met someone new, a man named Gabriel who had also been through divorce, who understood that healing isn't linear, who could hold space for her triggers without taking them personally, who demonstrated through consistent action that he was trustworthy. And this relationship felt entirely different. It felt calm rather than chaotic, secure rather than anxious, like coming home rather than constantly trying to earn the right to stay. But even in this healthier relationship, Carmen found herself facing old patterns. The urge to abandon her needs, to monitor his moods, to prevent conflict by accommodating. And recognizing these patterns was crucial because healing isn't about never having old wounds activated, but about catching yourself faster, choosing differently, communicating rather than retreating. And Gabriel's willingness to work through these moments with her, to reassure without resentment, to understand that her healing was ongoing, made the relationship a place of growth rather than just comfort. What Carmen learned through all of this, through the devastation and the rebuilding, is that betrayal by someone you love doesn't have to define you. It can break you open in ways that ultimately allow you to become more whole, more authentic, more connected to your own worth. And while she would never have chosen this path, would never minimize the pain of it, she also recognized that she was more herself now than she had been in her entire adult life. She understood that loving yourself isn't selfish but necessary, that boundaries aren't walls but bridges to genuine intimacy, that you teach people how to treat you not through words but through what you accept. And she had spent so long accepting crumbs that when someone offered her the whole meal, she almost didn't recognize it as something she deserved. The journey of healing from betrayal is not a straight line. It's a spiral where you revisit the same wounds at deeper levels, where you think you're done processing only to find another layer beneath, where anniversaries and memories and triggers can send you back into grief you thought you'd completed. And learning to be gentle with yourself through this process, to understand that healing has its own timeline and cannot be rushed, becomes an act of profound self-compassion. Carmen also learned that forgiveness, when and if it comes, is not about excusing what happened or reconciling with the person who harmed you. It's about releasing the hold that past has on your present, about no longer organizing your life around the injury, about reclaiming the energy you've been spending on anger or pain and redirecting it toward building the life you actually want. And maybe most importantly, she learned that you cannot love someone into treating you well. You cannot heal them or fix them or be enough to make them choose you. Because people's behavior toward you is about who they are, not who you are. And recognizing this, truly internalizing it, is what allows you to stop taking other people's dysfunction personally, to stop making their choices evidence of your worth or lack thereof. The women in Carmen's therapy group had all walked similar paths, different details but the same essential wound, the experience of being betrayed by someone they trusted, of having their reality manipulated, of questioning their own perceptions and worth. And together they created a space of witness and validation, where their pain was honored rather than minimized, where they could be messy and angry and grieving without performing recovery. Dr. Lilina often reminded them that the opposite of trauma is not the absence of pain, but the presence of connection, that healing happens in relationship, that you cannot think your way out of emotional injury. You have to feel your way through it. And this requires people who can sit with you in the darkness without trying to fix it or rush you toward the light. 3 years after leaving Robert, Carmen stood in her own apartment, a space she had created entirely according to her own preferences, filled with colors and textures and objects that meant something to her, and she felt something she hadn't felt in decades, a deep sense of being at home in her own life, of not performing or hiding or accommodating but simply being. And this quiet moment of self-recognition felt like the most profound achievement of her entire journey. She thought about the woman she had been, standing frozen in that hallway overhearing her husband's betrayal, and she felt compassion for how much courage it took to hear that truth and then act on it, for how she had to dismantle her entire life to build something authentic. And she wished she could go back and tell that terrified woman that she would not only survive, but that she would discover parts of herself she didn't know existed, strengths and capacities, and a fierce commitment to her own dignity. The research on post-traumatic growth is clear. While trauma is devastating and no one should have to endure it to become themselves, many people who go through significant suffering emerge with deeper compassion, stronger sense of purpose, greater appreciation for life, and more authentic relationships, not because the trauma was good, but because they did the hard work of metabolizing it, of integrating it into their story rather than being defined by it. Carmen now volunteers with a women's shelter, helping others who are navigating the aftermath of betrayal and abuse. And she finds that sharing her story, being honest about how hard it was and how worth it the healing has been, gives other women permission to choose themselves, to believe that life after devastation is possible, that they are not broken beyond repair, but simply injured and capable of healing. She tells them that the brain is neuroplastic, that you can literally rewire your neural pathways through consistent practice, that the attachment wounds that made you vulnerable to mistreatment can be healed, that you can learn to recognize green flags instead of only responding to red ones, that secure attachment is possible even if you didn't experience it growing up. And this isn't just inspirational talk but neuroscientific reality. And she tells them that healing requires both grieving what was lost and building what's possible, that you have to feel the full weight of your pain without drowning in it, that you need people who can witness your story without trying to rewrite it into something more palatable, that community and therapy and self-compassion are not luxuries but necessities, and that choosing yourself after a lifetime of choosing others is not selfish but sacred. Carmen's story, like so many women's stories, is not unique in its details but universal in its essence. The experience of being diminished in relationship, of having your reality denied, of discovering that the life you thought you were living was partly fiction, and then having to decide whether to keep pretending or to burn it down and start over. And while every woman makes her own choice and there is no single right answer, Carmen's path shows that leaving is possible, that healing is possible, that you can reclaim yourself even after years of losing yourself piece by piece. The work of becoming whole after betrayal is the work of a lifetime. It doesn't end after therapy or after leaving or after falling in love again. It continues in small daily choices to honor yourself, to speak your truth, to enforce boundaries, to ask for what you need, to walk away from what diminishes you. And each of these choices is a small revolution, a reclaiming of the self that was nearly lost. Today, Carmen is not bitter, but she is boundaried. She is not hardened, but she is discerning. She still believes in love, but she also believes in herself. And she knows that real intimacy requires two whole people choosing each other every day, not one person abandoning themselves to keep another comfortable. And this knowledge, hard-won and embodied, is what allows her to build relationships that nourish rather than deplete, that expand rather than contract, that honor the fullness of who she is rather than requiring her to shrink. And when she hears stories of other women discovering betrayal, of standing in hallways or reading messages or overhearing conversations that shatter their worlds, She feels the weight of their pain because she knows it intimately. And she also feels hope for them, because she knows that this moment of devastation can become the doorway to a more authentic life. That sometimes everything has to fall apart so you can build something real, something that doesn't require you to abandon yourself to maintain it. Something worth keeping.